All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Wysant. I am the outreach coordinator with 19 Services, and I coordinate a networking group for providers. We kind of live in the Facebook social media space called Network 19. And part of what we do at Network 19 is we coordinate and bring providers together on a monthly basis to talk about issues of importance. And so, again, we want to welcome you to our provider session for agencies today. We're glad you're here. And today we're going to be talking about Bill It Right, helping DSPs understand waiver billing. And in addition to myself, we'll introduce Christy Black. Christy, are you on?
I am. Hello, hello, everybody. Good to see everyone on.
Good morning. So Christy is our CEO at 19 Services. She has many years of experience in the field, and she is a wonderful resource. So we are glad to have her joining us today in this conversation. My name is Ann Wyson, as I said, and prior to being with 19 Services, I worked for the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities for 23 years and retired in December. So I'm really excited to bring some of that knowledge to these conversations, and we hope that you find it really helpful and beneficial. We certainly recognize that your time is important, so we want to make sure that we are meeting your needs and doing what we can do to help you. So we will start with our presentation. Part of the presentation today includes a toolkit that we've created for leadership and frontline supervisors at agencies to help you with supporting your DSPs in better understanding waiver billing and completing waiver billing. So after we go through the presentation, we'll go through that toolkit. And then my hope is that we'll also have some time at the end for questions, answers, sharing, and just any general discussion that you all would like to have. You all are starting the session with your audio on and your video on. Feel free to turn off either, but we're always happy to see your faces. And please feel free to either utilize the chat to type in questions. I'll do my best to monitor the chat box. If we don't get them during the session, we'll try to have some time at the end to go through questions, or just unmute and jump in and ask your question or share your experience. We're happy to have you do either. So, as I said, the intent of today's session is to really talk to you as supervisors and agency leaders about how you can support your DSPs to bill it right. And there are many reasons why that is important and why that's an important topic for us to talk about. First of all, your agency's revenue depends on DSP documentation. And that's certainly something that you all as leadership understand, but it's always a question of how much the direct support professional really understands that connection between the work they do, the documentation that they complete, and your agency's ability to continue services, pay for staff, pay for training, and all of the things that you utilize your funding for to support your programs. Also, audit scrutiny is intensifying. I think everybody has seen the recent communications that have come out from the state of Ohio regarding fraud prevention. It's not specific or unique to Ohio. It's certainly something that the federal administration is giving out guidance and some priorities to states on ways to better audit and check for potential fraud within the Medicaid systems. So we know that not only DODD audits, the audits that are occurring by state staff, but also potentially federal audits are going to intensify. And documentation is your verification of the services being provided, the implementation of the plan. DSPs often don't realize that their documentation is the billing. They don't know necessarily the connection between that piece of paper that they fill out and then where does it go? What happens to it when my supervisor comes in at the end of the month and picks it up? Do they understand within your organization kind of how the fiscal team utilizes their documentation to complete the billing process and verification of services? And supervisors and frontline staff are the connectors. You are the ones that connect the quality of the services that are being provided, which is indicated by the completion of documentation, with the fiscal health of your organization. And that role is critical. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I have been fighting some kind of respiratory bug for almost 3 weeks now. So if I get to coughing, I will stop and grab a cough drop and take a quick little break to get through it. But I do apologize if that interferes with our conversation today. So today there are some things that we want to make sure that you leave with. We want to make sure that you all also understand how Ohio's waiver billing chain works, and that we can share that with our direct support professionals. We want to make sure that direct support professionals are aware of what Ohio requires for documentation to be acceptable. What are those elements that are required for documentation to be compliant? We want to make sure that you have the tools that you need to teach DSPs how to write and complete billable documentation, documentation that will align with the services in the plan, the services that have been authorized, and then stand up for any audit or verification that's requested in the future. And we did have a question, so I will let you know now. And I'm sorry if I kind of slipped through that slide really quick. But yes, all of today's handouts, as well as the PowerPoint, will be sent to you within the next 2 or 3 days. The session will also be shared on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and refer to something that was said, or look at something or whatever, it will be there. If there are peers and colleagues that you work with who couldn't attend today, they can certainly go back and check that out on our YouTube channel. And then also for those folks who attend the live session today, you will receive a certificate of attendance, a training certificate. Those are not available for watching the YouTube video, but they are available for attendance at the live sessions. And then also when we go through the toolkit and the handouts that we have for you, those will also be included in that follow-up email. So great question. Thank you for asking. And I apologize that I did not thoroughly go through that when we were talking. So the other three objectives for today is to also make sure that you are thinking about what your agency's process looks like for reviewing documentation for accuracies and spotting red flags, and then having a plan, a support plan to support your DSPs in improving their documentation. Also knowing when and how to escalate concerns. So we're going to talk through all of those things today. So the general overview of the waiver service process from development to payment is pretty simple. We start with a service plan. The team develops it, it gets finalized, it gets given to the agency. The agency distributes that throughout to the direct support professionals. You provide the required training and go over that ISP with them. Services are authorized in the pause. Sometimes that's an invisible part of the process. It's not always that the direct support professional or even sometimes frontline supervisors are familiar with the pause. Many times that will go directly to a fiscal person within an agency, but it is important for folks to understand what the pause is, and pause stands for Payment Authorization for Waiver Services. And the fact that that pause really holds the fiscal framework of services for that person. So that pause is going to tell you not only what the services are that have been authorized in the ISP. It's also going to make sure that you know what the service code is that's aligned with that service, what the payment rate is for that service, and then most importantly, how many units of that service is available for that person per fiscal year. So the pause is divided into a fiscal year. So if a pause starts on, let's say, March 1st, you're going to see those units divided from March 1st till June 30th, which would be the first half of the fiscal year. And then from July 1st to February 28th, which would be the second half of the fiscal year. So, as a supervisor, it is important to make sure that as you are reviewing documentation, as you are communicating and conversing with your fiscal team, that there is a good understanding of where you are with the number of units that have been delivered so that you don't get to the end of the fiscal year for that person and find out that you either have run out of units and therefore you can't bill for additional services, or you've not used all the services or the units available. And so therefore you have this pot of unused units where you could go back and have a conversation with the team, with the SSA about how to utilize those unused units. So being able to monitor that is really important, and making sure that, again, the DSP has some understanding of how many units are available and what is that process that our agency uses to track those units to make sure that we either don't go over or that we have an unused amount of services that we could be providing. Services are then delivered as indicated in the ISP, and then the claims process. A accurate claim is submitted by the agency in a timely manner, which we hope then results in reimbursement. Just want to make sure I covered everything I have in my notes. The other thing, when we talk about the first step in this process, the services in the ISP and how those are developed, I just want you all to think within your own agency, how do you include your direct support professionals in that process? It would be great if every direct support professional could attend the ISP meetings for the people that they support, because we know that they are the folks who really, really have that daily understanding of what people experience, what their reactions are to those experiences, and then what those reactions and experiences tell us about the person's wants and needs. But we also know that it's just not possible for every DSP to attend. And generally, what we will see is someone from a supervisory position or a leadership position within the organization attending those meetings. But if you are attending those meetings, are you gathering input from your DSPs? What does that look like? How are you utilizing the documentation? We know that DSPs are the voice of the people that they serve in many cases. And so just making sure that you as an agency are thinking about how you capture that. And if that DSP is involved from the very beginning in understanding and being a part of developing the services listed in the ISP, then that makes it easier for them to then understand how the services are authorized in the pause, how they got there. It makes it easier for them to deliver those services because they are familiar with what's going to show up in that ISP. And then again, all of those things help us go towards that final outcome of having a claim that is billable and supported by the documentation. So, what does that billing chain within your organization look like? Obviously, the first step is the DSP delivering the services based on what's in the ISP and what they've been trained on, and then the DSP documenting that service. But once we hit step number two, if those first two things have not occurred appropriately or successfully, then steps 3 through 6 can't happen. So we have to focus on those first two steps to make sure that DSPs have the support, the information, and the knowledge they need to complete steps 1 and 2 successfully so that your organization then can then move on to steps 3, 4, and 5. Step 3 is the supervisor or the frontline supervisor reviewing that documentation and having a solid, good process for that review so that then when it gets to your fiscal folks, whoever within your agency is responsible for claim submission, being able to bill and submit that claim then going through the Ohio Medicaid review process, and then finally resulting in the agency receiving reimbursement. Simply said, no documentation means no billing, no reimbursement, and no revenue, regardless of the quality of care provided. You can be meeting every need the person has. You can be providing quality services. But if this step fails at any one of, if this process fails at any one of these steps, then you're going to lose out on that revenue. So again, it's really important. And I hope that when we get to the toolkit, that will give you some tools and support in making sure that this process successfully goes from step 1 to step 6. And I'm going to take just a quick break here and take a look at some of the comments we have in chat. And thank you, Christy, and folks who are answering. Appreciate your support. So if the DSP doesn't document it, it didn't happen. If it didn't happen, we can't bill for it. And if we can't bill for it, we're unable to sustain services. So it's so vitally important, again, that DSP understands that their documentation is really what sustains the services that you as an agency provides, and that they are playing a pivotal role in not only the services being delivered directly to the person, but also in the ongoing success of the organization. Organizational culture is vitally important for agencies, and making sure that your DSPs are actively involved in all aspects of your business can have such a positive impact on the work that DSPs do, ensuring their satisfaction with their jobs, helping you all have DSPs who are there for long periods of time, not seeing as much turnover within your workforce. And one small way of promoting a positive organizational culture is really engaging with your DSPs and educating them not only about, again, service delivery. That's what we always focus on. We focus on, training on service delivery. We focus on all those required trainings that are in rule. Really, there's no place in rule that says DSPs are required to have documentation training or training on the billing process. So while it's not in rule, it is certainly something that is part of a positive organizational culture you can help educate your DSPs on, so that they not only, again, are successfully completing the documentation that leads to revenue, but they also feel a valued part of the organization and that they understand and know how valued their role is. So, what's really at stake? What is the real cost of poor documentation? Well, obviously, it's the lack of funding. So, revenue from undocumented services is zero. If the documentation doesn't occur, there are no notes, there's no documentation, there cannot be any billing. 6 years. So Ohio and the federal government, and there is somewhat of a discrepancy in different rules. Some rules say 6 years, other rules say 7 years. So we always recommend that you do at least 6. And Again, best practice is probably 7 because federal law has a couple of different places that address Medicaid documentation reimbursement, and there for years has been a little discrepancy in that. But again, if you don't maintain those records and they are not kept for at least the 6 years or 7 years, and you're audited, then again, you are going to have no revenue. There's going to be a payback if that documentation isn't available. Also, there are 350 days in which you can file claims. So you have to make sure that your agency is looking at that process. You would be surprised. I think most people would be like, oh, of course, agencies bill regularly. They bill every week. Coming to you again from a position at the State Department over so many years, you would not believe the number of agencies that we work to support who were facing financial issues. They were unable to pay their staff. They were seeing large turnover because of staff being dissatisfied with, with the work they were doing or with the agency itself. And we would look and see that, well, the reason that they couldn't make payroll last week, and we had DSPs calling us, sharing their concerns about not getting paid, was that they hadn't submitted billing for 6 months. So it does happen, and it happens more frequently than you would think, given the fact that claims reimbursement is very obviously what's necessary to maintain services. And then if services are non-compliant and they are found to fail during an audit because the documentation doesn't exist to support the claim, there's 100% recoupment rate for every unit that you can't validate through documentation. The reimbursement that was given for that unit of service will be recouped by the federal government. So these are big numbers, potentially big numbers. So poor documentation doesn't just lose revenue, it also potentially puts an agency's Medicaid participation at risk. So there is a really high stake in making sure that DSPs are accurately documenting. So let's talk about what I call the non-negotiable 14. These are 14 things that are required by rule to be included in documentation. And this was specifically built around homemaker personal care documentation. So as all of you know, each waiver service has its own standalone rule that defines the service, outlines the qualifications for the provider who can provide those services, and then also outlines the documentation requirements for those services. Many of these things are duplicative across all service types. So every documentation, regardless of service type, has to have the individual's name. It has to have the individual's Medicaid number. But some of these are specific to homemaker personal care services. So I do encourage you, and again, when we get into the toolkit, you'll see that there are different support tools in there that go over this non-negotiable 14. If you're going to use something similar and you're billing adult day or you're billing transportation, I would encourage you to create a non-negotiable for each of the documentation requirements for each service that you're providing. But just as an example, I created this based on what is in the homemaker personal care rule. So the ones that are in orange, kind of the burnt orange color here, those are things that I recommend be pre-populated on the documentation sheets. It's really easy to use an individual's um, nickname or shortened name. But if that name doesn't match what is on the pause or what is on the person's official Medicaid record, there can be an issue. So I always recommend that your agency pre-populate that on documentation sheets with the person's official legal name, whatever name they're actually getting their Medicaid services under. It's also super easy to transpose numbers or miss a number on the person's Medicaid number. So again, that's something that really easily can be ensured that it's accurate by making sure that it is pre-populated for your DSPs. The provider contract number and the provider name, again, I know I'm going to use an agency that I'm familiar with. It's an agency called Smith Homes. I'm making it up. And Smith Homes operates a day program called The Biz. And so sometimes the provider or the DSPs where it says provider name will put the biz. And that's not the name of the provider. There's no provider certified under the name the biz. That's just what they happen to call their day program. So making sure that that provider name is consistent with the certified name of the provider and that that provider contract number is accurate. So those are four things that can be ensured to be accurate if your agency just makes sure that those are pre-populated when the documentation sheets are provided. The other non-negotiables are the date of service, the type of service, the start and stop times of the service, the place or location of the service, the description of supports provided, often called the scope, the number of units, the individual's response to services, the ISP alignment, progress or documentation of the person's progress, and the DSP's signature or initials. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but there are a couple that I just want to make sure that I share um, kind of some guidance on how the compliance folks at the department kind of define those. So ISP alignment is one of the required elements that most people ask for clarification on. Reviewers are looking to see if the service being documented is actually tied to the service plan. We recommend that DSPs utilize terms and language found in the ISP to help describe the services they are providing. For example, Mark has an outcome in his plan to increase independence in meal preparation. The DSP assists Mark with reading a recipe and creating a shopping list. A good way to document ISP alignment would be for the DSP to note reviewed recipe ingredients with Mark and created a shopping list for him so that he can make the recipe to help increase his independence in meal preparation. So you've tied the activity that was completed in with the service or the outcome of increasing independence in meal preparation. If the note in the documentation can clearly make that connection to the ISP, that's going to be so beneficial in an audit or a compliance review because it's very clearly able to be tied directly back and aligned with the ISP. Another issue or another negotiable that we get questions about is the DSP signature or initials. And it can be either one, but if you are using initials in your documentation format, it's important to understand that you need to have a legend so that if I put AW and the reviewer looks at that and they see AW, they're able to go to a legend where it shows AW equals Ann Weissent. And then they can clearly say, okay, that's Ann Weissent. She's a direct support professional. We looked at the schedule. She was on duty that day during the start and stop times that she indicated. So again, that's one other way to help ensure that as auditors, as reviewers are looking at our documentation, there is a clear tie back to the date the service was provided, the time the support was provided, and the actual DSP who provided that service. Oops, sorry. Another document that you're going to find in the toolkit that we're going to provide you today is a framework that I call the WHIP framework. The WHIP framework stands for what? So making sure that documentation clearly indicates what service or support was provided. And as I talked about with ISP alignment, it has to match the services that are identified in the individual's service plan. And we recommend that, again, the language that is utilized to write the documentation notes specifies the support being delivered and ties it back to the service plan. The H in WHIP stands for how. How did you provide it? Describe your specific actions. Did you give verbal prompts? Did you utilize hand over hand assistance? Did you do modeling, physical assistance? Also, make sure that those descriptions are being tied back to how the service is supposed to be delivered in the service plan. So obviously we know the service plan is going to give us some indicators of whether the person requires or needs verbal prompts. It's going to also give us a indication of the supervision level. So while I was providing this service, how did I do that in regards to the person's supervision level? So being as descriptive as possible to explain how that service is being provided. And I apologize. I don't know what's going on with my camera, but I noticed that I'm going in and out of screen. So I apologize for that. The I in WHIP stands for individual response. Making sure again that you're noting or that the DSP is noting how did the individual respond to the service being provided. Capture information about their behaviors. What was their mood that day? Those two things are great indicators if the documentation, when it gets to the progress point, is showing that there wasn't good progress that day towards that outcome or towards that goal. So being able to look at the individual's response and saying, you know what, this makes sense. Anne had a doctor's appointment that day. She was really in a bad mood because she doesn't like going to the doctor. No wonder she didn't do well when we sat down to work on whatever the outcome was we were going to work on. Not only does that help the DSP in being able to make sure that the next person on shift kind of knows what's going on. It also, in the long run, as far as documentation and how it's used within the overall process, gives the team a little bit of an insight into that person, what's going on with them, and that may indicate a need for some revision or some change to the plan. So individual response is not only a short term, like this helps us today or next week. It's also something that can be pulled together through documentation to really help drive the team in developing the framework for services. And then also progress. What progress towards the ISP outcomes occurred during that service delivery? And you want to make sure that DSPs aren't just focusing on the negative. I know that we drive a lot about making sure that we document negative things, whether that's something so negative that it results in a UI or an MUI, or just somebody had a really bad day, but also the positives. Progress is making strides towards a goal or towards an outcome. So we also want to make sure that we're giving equal time in documentation to those positive outcomes, and connecting that progress directly to their goals in the service plan. Every note within documentation should answer all four of these questions. And I'm going to take a quick little break here and just take a look at comments. So somebody asked, could you please clarify for me the individual's response to services? Yes. So again, that would be a place where you would indicate, did someone refuse a service? And maybe get some clarification on it. Do you know why they refused the service? Maybe everybody went out to a ball game the night before, and they didn't get home until 11 or 11:30, and folks didn't get in bed until 12 or 12:30. It was a long night. And so Anne has an outcome that she's supposed to, or that she wants to learn more about. Let's use Mark as an example. Mark wants to learn more about independently preparing meals, and you all had planned that the next morning Mark was going to get up and prepare breakfast for everybody. But Mark's like, I'm not getting out of bed. So what was his response when you tried to provide that service, right? He was like, nope, I'm not getting out of bed. Or, yeah, we did it, but we didn't do it until 10 o'clock. And the reason for that was because we all were out late at a ball game, whatever. So yeah, it's that individual's response to those services. And often that's an indicator that maybe the person's needs or wants have changed. A lot of times, of course, we know person-centered planning is based on what's important to the person and for the person. And so while those four things are usually things that, the team, the provider, and other people think are important, the two things are things that are important to me as the person receiving those services. And maybe the response is, I just don't want to do this anymore. I'm no longer interested in this. So yes, it's just capturing that individual response. I hope that helps clarify. I'm reading through another one. When a DSP is done, they have columns to check off for services. So somebody asked, the DSP is there's like a check off to say the staff will assist Lisa with preparing her lunch. The DSP puts their initials on there. Is that enough? So the 14 required elements require that you tie that service back to the plan. Um, I think that if we're talking about minimum compliance, if you can look at this documentation, you can see that the goal is also a goal in the plan. You've met minimum compliance. That's what I tell people. I was a licensure manager, so I was a compliance manager for 14 years or 18 years at the department. And that's what I used to tell providers all the time. Like it's exciting when you get a review and you get no citations. That's amazing. That is really an indicator of quality, right? But it is a test of minimum compliance. And so again, I encourage you as an agency to think about, are there ways that we can go above and beyond? And if I have a DSP who's writing a narrative and writing some type of a note about how that service was delivered with Lisa, how Lisa did when she was preparing her lunch, what was the progress she made, that leads to better outcomes for people. It helps share the voice of the DSP with the team or with leadership who can then take it to the team. So I recommend that, but I do think that as far as minimum compliance goes, if the outcome or the service that's listed on the documentation aligns with the ISP, you have met minimum compliance. Sorry, lots of conversation in chat about this. Um, this is where, so I think I've kind of captured all of that. Um, I hope that that clarifies. If anybody wants to unmute and jump in, we can further the conversation, but I think I've answered or reflected the comments that are in chat. And thank you all for that. Okay. Again, feel free to unmute and jump in if you want to, or if we need to have any additional conversation. Let's talk about contemporaneous documentation. Big word for timely. So the requirements are that documentation be written contemporaneously, meaning that it is timely. The federal rule that talks about the contemporaneousness of documentation doesn't give a clear, like within 15 minutes, within an hour. We all know rules are never that black and white, right? Um, it really says at the time of service or as close as possible. And so I think that it really is prudent for an agency to really have in mind, like, what is our definition of contemporaneous and how do we train our staff on what that means. So it's not just making sure that the details are fresh, and that it's not coming from your memory. I mean, literally, there are days I can't remember what I had for dinner the night before. So for me to wait 2 or 3 days to write a documentation or a note about the service I provided isn't really going to give clear details and accurate information about what happened. It's also something that helps to ensure that there aren't red flags being raised. If a reviewer or an auditor looks at documentation and it looks like for some reason, somebody went in a week later and documented everything, and as a reviewer, we all had little red flags in our head. Things like, is it the exact same pen? It's the exact same blue penmanship for a whole week, or something like that. Those would be indicators that we would start asking more questions about, the contemporaneousness of the documentation. Um, Really, we encourage that you all kind of make it a non-negotiable, right? You should not, as a DSP, leave your shift without completing your documentation. Um, and we know we have DSPs who are working long shifts. We know that sometimes you can be in a congregate setting for a day or more providing services. And so anything beyond 24 hours really increases the compliance risk for those red flag indicators. And then if you can, as a supervisor, look at ways that you can build documentation time in to the last few minutes of a shift. Do you have a system in place where maybe there's an overlap at shift change, so that the new person coming in, the new DSP coming in, can take over and provide the supervision and the supports needed while the DSP who's getting ready to leave is able to go to, the staff space at the location and complete their documentation. So looking at ways that you can build that concept of timely documentation into your DSP's daily work. All right. One more comment here. Thank you. Wendy says, Amen. It's mandatory. Yes, absolutely. So let's talk about what you can do to help make sure that you have a system in place for reviewing documentation for accuracy, and then also having a coaching plan in place, that when those indicators or red flags are identified, you have a plan on how you can work with your DSP to improve their documentation. So first of all, you want to look at completeness. Are all of the required elements present? Whether that's the 14 required elements that are listed in the tools we're going to give you, that it's built around homemaker personal care, or whether you're utilizing, a different required elements document for transportation, adult day, or any other service that you're providing. Every missing field is a potential audit finding and billing denial. So making sure that all of those required elements are part of the documentation that's been completed. Looking for the ISP match. Does the documentation tie to a specific ISP outcome or experience? Individualization. Making sure that each note is specific to the person. You would be surprised again, and maybe not, but again, as a reviewer, how many times we would go out and we would see just duplicate comments. Anne had a good day today. if it's a daily service or something like, going to an adult day program. That would be the entire documentation for the day. And then we would see that note listed 22 times in a month. And so it wasn't individualized. It wasn't, again, making that connection to Anne's plan. It wasn't giving any indicator of Anne's response to that service, the progress she was making. So again, making sure that documentation is individualized. The contemporaneousness or the timeliness. Um, oh, sorry. I jumped to the last one. Let's go to time accuracy. So this is the start and stop times. Do they match the billing? And do they make logical sense? Again, we often would see, and I think sometimes it's just, an uh, unintentional documentation error, but using PM in place of AM or AM in place of PM, overlapping. So showing a start and stop time with one person when the ratio was supposed to be 1-on-1 and not 2-on-1. And then we would notice that another person in that group had the exact same start and stop times. Also making sure that the times are consistent with the number of units being billed. And often that gets reviewed or that gets checked at the fiscal level within your agency. But also just making sure that if the DSP is putting those units in, do they understand what the unit is for that service? Is it a 15-minute unit? Is it a daily unit? So making sure that those things all match. Um, the service match. Does the service, the type of service, which is one of those 14 required elements, does it match the service that was authorized in the pause? So not only what is it a service that's in the ISP, but it's also a service that's authorized in the pause. For example, we would often see someone using the service code or describing the service as transportation when in effect it was non-medical transportation. And so those are two different services. So making sure that the right service type is being documented. And then the contemporaneousness, the timeliness. Was it completed within a reasonable amount of time? Because late documentation raises compliance concerns, and if you have to defend yourself, write a plan of correction. You're going to maybe try to appeal a citation. You've got to have that so that you can defend that citation if necessary. As a supervisor, it's important to set aside time for reviewing documentation for accuracy and using that time as an opportunity to identify what type of support and outreach can I provide to a DSP who is potentially struggling. As part of the toolkit we're going to go over, we have a 6-point checklist that will help you in developing a succinct system for documentation review. So documentation red flags every supervisor must catch. And so, oops, sorry. So they are cross-referenced with kind of why it matters. So you definitely want to look for identical or copy and paste notes across multiple dates, across multiple people in the same cohort. Excuse me, because that can be a fraud indicator. Auditors will flag patterns, and they often will trigger a much further chart review and potentially a recoupment. Another red flag is that the document fails to reference the ISP. Again, it would be an unbillable note or documentation would be unbillable if it can't be tied to the ISP and the services in the ISP. The start and stop times that we talked about, that is often an indicator of a duplicate billing, and Medicaid will deny overlapping claims. And again, it can be a indicator of potential fraud. So I will say this out loud. Um, One of the things that the governor indicated in his statement, uh, his release last week was about red flags. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about, well, what are those red flags? And we've not received anything. And I'm sure there will be new Medicaid rules that are being drafted under the emergency that the governor put in place, but it's still going to take some time for those to be completed. Um, what I will tell you, again, coming from the regulatory world at the state level, there have been red flags that all auditors, that all reviewers, whether they're Ohio Department of Health reviewers, whether they're DODD reviewers, whether they are the Ohio Department of Medicaid reviewers, these are some of those red flags that we always have looked at. And there's always been a process whereby if there are potential indicators of fraud because of some of these red flags and others, that we would then forward or escalate those concerns to the uh, Medicaid fraud unit in uh, David Yost's office, who would then open an investigation. So I don't anticipate that things are potentially going to look a lot different than what they have looked like over the years. I do think that there will probably be some clear definition in some upcoming rules of what those are. But until we know, these are some things that I can tell you are already red flag indicators that most auditors and most reviewers are looking for. Um, Vague language, just did good or had a good day or whatever. Again, there's no measurable progress. There is a concern that that might not support the billing claim. So going back to that recommendation that, yeah, even if you have a check box or a place just to put initials that this happened, making sure that you are supporting the notation of how that service was delivered. Um, Documentation being completed days or weeks after service delivery, more units being billed than hours documented. So again, a lot of this is part of that overall process. And you're probably going to look at that comparison of units with start and stop times and hours at the fiscal level. But again, making sure your DSP understands how that process works. And then services documented that aren't authorized in the pause. So if you see any of these red flags, you really do need to stop and address them immediately with the DSP. One missed flag is a coaching opportunity. A pattern of missed flags can become a liability for the agency. So, as supervisors, really paying attention to what are those red flags, how do we catch them, and then how do we coach or support our DSPs to make sure they understand why it's a red flag and what they can do to make sure that they correct those errors. So, there are 6 different coaching strategies that we talk about in the toolkit. So once you've done that review, maybe you've identified some red flags and you're saying, okay, I really need to support my DSP. I need to do some coaching with them. So there's a number of different ways that you can do that. The review, coach, and practice style is a review of the documentation together with your DSP, coaching them so that you can create or teach that correction, and then have them practice it. Give them opportunities to rewrite that note or that documentation with you side by side. Praise publicly and coach privately. Recognize and celebrate good documentation. Find ways to let your team know how important documentation is. It is so important that we are highlighting people who do well. We are highlighting, the system, and we're going to focus on that through review, through coaching, and then through recognition. Um, Address poor documentation, but do that one on one. A lot of this goes back to, again, kind of that organizational culture, not calling people out in front of their peers, but actually spending time one on one with them to say, I recognize that you may need some more support around documentation and doing good documentation. How can I help you? Let's have some one on one time, and then utilize some of these coaching tools that we're going to give you. Again, side by side comparison, show documentation. Do this as part of your team meetings or staff meetings, whether that's in one home or one location, or whether that's the whole agency as a group coming together. But share comparisons of uncompliant documentation next to correct documentation. My only caveat with that is use examples. Don't pull from real documentation. And the only reason I say that is because when you work in let's say a residential setting, and you've got four DSPs that work that particular home, they all see each other's notes, they all see each other's documentation. So if you're holding one person's up as that example of compliant documentation, of good documentation, there begins to be that internal, oh, well, Ann's was good, but Christie's wasn't. They never talked about, Sue's, but they talked about Sean's. So use examples, create examples.
Hey, Anne, we have a question in the comment box that says, how do you navigate the copy and paste issue when you have an individual that is very routine oriented?
When you have a DSP that's very routine oriented,
An
or the
individual.
person receiving services is very routine oriented.
Hannah, you can confirm, but I was sort of reading it as the person
I
served.
was gonna say, I'll just unmute myself for a second. So yeah, I have an individual that is autistic. And so he is very routine. I mean, we're literally doing most of the same things nearly every day. Is a great example. Workout class, and then he comes home, showers, we make dinner together, he will clean the kitchen, he goes to church. Like that is every Wednesday. There's maybe been through the years like two or three Wednesdays where this will be different. But like this is just an example that he's very routine and very consistent. And so I do tend to document for him most of the same things. So I just would like to know then if there's maybe a different way to approach this, or if that's not necessarily an issue because this is just his routine.
Yeah, I'm going to ask if there's anybody else who has a similar situation, and do you want to share kind of how you all deal with that?
I will. I have an individual that I do share living with. My name is Stevie. She pretty much has the same routine every day. I just try and encourage her to do something a little different from time to time. Like she comes in from the workshop, she puts her things away, she grabs a snack, she goes to watch TV. This is every day. Sometimes I'll encourage her to come and sit out on a deck with me, come and do something, out of her norm, or maybe go in there with her and sit and watch TV just to try and mix it up a little bit. But I found myself writing the same thing on part of her um, documentation as well. That first part of coming in from the workshop, she does exactly the same thing every single day. But at 4 o'clock, she goes for a walk every single day, unless the weather's bad. So it's her prerogative to do what she does, and what she wants to do is to watch TV. Thumbs down, nothing else. She just wants to watch Cowboys all day. So trying to switch that up is a chore at times, but I'll add in some little things to try and get her to do something. Like instead of her doing her laundry on Saturdays, switch it up and have her do it on Wednesdays. Just give her something a little different to do. And
Thanks, Stevie.
that's all I can encourage is just to do something, switch something, have an idea to get them to do something different.
Great,
I
great
too have
feedback.
two. Can you guys
Thank
see
you.
me? Sorry.
Yeah.
I too have two individuals that there is no getting them out of, and I three document the same thing constantly because that is what he wants to do. That is what she wants to do. It's their prerogative, and there is no changing um what they like to do. So I
It
would
can
like some
definitely be a
answers as well.
challenge. It can definitely be a challenge. Um, Catherine also noted something in comment that I want to share. And again, thank you all for sharing your experiences. She says, document what he does, but also add in details about each day. What did he enjoy in his workout class? What conversations did you have? What did he like or not like about the day? Did you ask him to try something new or try to make a new plan? Even though some people are very routine, their days are still different in some ways, even if small. And I think that gets back to that question about, how detailed does our documentation have to be? And again, to meet that minimum compliance, you check mark that it happened, but if you really are looking at documentation as a tool to not only get to the outcome of reimbursement, but then also that bigger, broader outcome of how can this help drive the team? How can it help our organization and others who work with this person to learn more about them, to find out something new, etc. Encouraging that note that really describes the services, the responses, and the progress, I think can help people be creative and see that, even though, and I'm going to use Hannah, even though this is Hannah's experience with the person, I come in and work with this person, a couple times a week, and I had a different experience and tried something new, and I share that, and Hannah sees that and says, I never thought about that, right? So it is a great way to help, staff who are working with the same person to potentially see other people's views. We all, have different experiences with people we serve. Getting together as a team, when you have your home meetings or your staff meetings or your team meetings, and talking about, this is my experience with the person that we're supporting. It seems to always be the same. Does anybody have any other experience? Having, the DSPs get together and do an exercise where they like, okay, let's talk about, or let's think about what the
You
service
order
we
your
provided
salad
John
and
the
a
last time
pizza.
we provided for him.
No.
Everybody take five
You order
minutes
the
and
salad and a
document that
pizza.
service. And now let's share them
No.
around with each
You
other.
order a
And we
salad
can
and a
begin to
pizza.
see that maybe somebody,
Are we going
um,
to eat it all? Yep.
maybe somebody had a different experience or they interpreted their experience with that
No.
person differently and they wrote that in their
Okay.
their sample documentation,
Well,
and then
like
it
that.
gets us all to thinking of, like Stevie said, even though it's
If you
every day I
want
come
that,
home and I get a snack,
the meeting.
well, maybe someone else is like, okay, I've got this pack of crackers and I'm just going to offer it to the
No.
person, where someone else is like, oh,
No.
I want to get her in the kitchen and get her more involved. And
Yeah,
so,
put yourself on mute.
we
Sorry.
went in the kitchen and we made peanut butter crackers ourselves instead of using a prepackaged one. And so it's the same routine, but we just implemented that service a little bit differently. And by sharing those things, when you have multiple staff working with someone, it can really begin to let you like think about it a little bit differently. So that would be my recommendation. These are great questions. Thank you all so much. Someone else. Oh, yeah, somebody just suggested if you're unmuted and not asking a question, if you could just go back on mute, that would be great. Thanks. Using the WIP framework, the who, I'm sorry, I put who in there. It's what, the what, how, the individual response, and the progress. Print that. Again, you're going to have a document in your toolkit. Print it, post it, share it, use it as a teaching tool and a training tool. A lot of agencies have documentation books for a house or a certain location. Put that in the front of the book, so that every time your DSPs are opening up to do their documentation, they're thinking about that WIP framework. Tie documentation to performance reviews. Include documentation quality as a scored component of your evaluation process. If it's a low score, the DSP is struggling, then revert to coaching. But discipline, again, thinking about organizational culture, discipline should really be tied to last resort. Like I have coached this DSP. We've gone through some exercises, but we are continuing to not see any change in how they document. So always build your support around documentation for your DSPs based on this positive support of coaching, and then using discipline when necessary. And then when possible, whether it's at the end of a shift, whether it's in your team meetings, your staff meetings, whenever you can, look at doing documentation huddles. A quick huddle to review one example or reinforce one tip, or recognize a documentation success. Maybe talking about, Mark had his ISP meeting last week, and guys, I wanted to let you all know we reviewed your documentation before we went to the meeting. We shared a lot of your insight with the team, and the team really decided that, Mark has done so well with implementing his or reaching his outcome of independently doing meal preparation, that now they want to move on to something, new and different for Mark. But that's how important your documentation was. So using 5 minutes of your time with your team to really focus on documentation, whether that is an example of success, whether that's sharing a tip, whatever it is, just making sure that that's part of your regular conversations. All right, and I will make sure that I make this correction. I'm gonna circle it on my handout, and I will make that correction before the PowerPoint gets sent out to you guys. I apologize for the error on that. Okay. So we've built into our agency system a process by which we are reviewing documentation. We are coaching our team on, documentation skills and educating them on the importance and the process. We are identifying red flags. We're responding to those red flags. But what happens? What do we do if there really is a documentation concern that we feel like needs to be escalated? And so this kind of gets you through the 4 levels, starting with, those one-time minor documentation issues, using those as a teaching moment, and using coaching tools to have a conversation with the direct support professional. At level 2, when there's a pattern of incomplete or late documentation that is significant or that persists even after coaching, really moving to a written corrective action. That way you're documenting the conversation, and the DSP is going away with understanding what their expected improvements are. And in your toolkit, there is a coaching checklist that you could use as that written corrective action, because that coaching checklist results in a written follow-up plan. Level 3, again, when there are repeated failures despite coaching, maybe the documentation error was so egregious that it actually did end up in some type of a audit finding, developing a performance improvement plan, setting measurable goals with the DSP, and defining strict timelines for improvement. Level 4, if you as a supervisor are reviewing documentation and you truly believe there's been intentional suspected falsification, that maybe the DSP didn't even work that day, but for some reason they came in and documented that day. Were they covering for another staff who didn't document? You don't know what that is, but there's some indicator that you are concerned that this could possibly be an indicator of fraud or purposeful falsification. Then escalating that to your compliance team, your internal compliance team, or your leadership. And so making sure within your organization, as part of your system of internal compliance, that you have a pathway developed for how do you as a supervisor escalate that concern up to leadership or to the compliance officer for your organization. And then finally, that leadership or compliance officer is going to be determining whether or not this needs to be escalated up to the county board, DODD, or even to the Ohio Department of Medicaid. And that's generally when the organization has identified that there is evidence of Medicaid fraud, that someone has purposely documented incorrectly to receive compensation. And so that is something that your leadership, your compliance leadership or compliance officer or team needs to make sure that they have a plan in place for how they're going to make those reports. We also recommend that you document when you're beginning to get into this escalation pathway, that you're documenting each step. Each escalation requires written documentation of the concern, the action taken, and the DSP's response. This allows you to protect the individual, the DSP, and the agency so that even if the outcome of an investigation, either at the agency leadership level or even at the state level or county level, would be that, okay, thank you for reporting this to us. We've looked at it, we've reviewed everything, and we don't believe there's an indicator of fraud or purposeful falsification. You have done your due diligence. And as an agency, you're able to show that you have those checks and balances within your organization to also look for those indicators of, potential fraud within the billing process. Okay, so before we get to the wrap up, I'm going to try to share my screen. So bear with me here while I switch over. Okay.
Come on in.
So navigating is sometimes not my strong suit within. Oh, goodness. Okay. Where is my share screen? There we go. Nope. Okay, I'm back. Now if I can find my share screen. There we go. I am so sorry for those technical difficulties here. Okay, if someone could just give me a thumbs up. John, is it Liggins? Liggins, I can see you. Thank you. You can see my screen? Perfect. Thank you, thank you.
Yes, I
Okay,
can
so
share.
appreciate your assistance here. All right, so let's take a look. These are all going to be in the handouts that you're going to get. So the first toolkit we have for you is the DSP documentation support sheets. So this is a toolkit that is designed for the direct support professional. It is a 6 separate support sheets. Now I've put this all in one guide. You could break this out and do each of the sheets separately, put it together in a packet for your DSPs, use it as a training outline, however you want to best utilize this guide. The first support sheet in this guide is the non-negotiable 14. So again, this is based on homemaker personal care, but it is kind of plain language definitions of what each of those 14 elements are so that the DSP understands really what a auditor or reviewer would be looking for when they're looking for those required elements. So again, there's a blue box at the top that indicates each separate support sheet, so you can easily divide this toolkit if you wanted to separate them out. It might be something where, as we talked about, dedicating, time at staff meetings to talk about documentation. Maybe you use one of these support sheets at each of your next upcoming 6 meetings over the course of 6 months or whatever, but you can use this however best fits your training needs with your DSPs. The second one is a DSP support sheet on the WIP framework. Again, explaining to them what each letter indicates, the what did you do, how did you do it, what was the individual's response, and what was the progress. And it just gives some tips and examples for the DSP in regards to how they can document or note the what, how individual response and progress. The third support sheet is called good notes versus bad notes. And again, this is where I said just give examples, don't necessarily pull from anyone's actual documentation. But these are just some examples that I came up with that could be shared to show the difference between a poor documentation example and a good documentation example. And each of these support sheets, also, what I like about them is we try to go back and kind of just put some points in here that reflect back to things that they may have already learned or things that you may have already talked about. The fourth sheet is about contemporaneous or timing of your documentation. So again, just giving some examples of what is the best time to document, what's a good time, what's a little bit risky, and what is absolutely unacceptable when it comes to the timeliness of documentation. The fifth one is just going over in a big picture manner why documentation matters. Why is it important? The sixth support sheet is just a quick reference. It talks a little bit about many of the most utilized services, what documentation should focus on with those services, whether start and stop times are required, and whether EVV is required. And then with that sixth one, there's also just some everyday habits and a plain language glossary. This may be especially helpful for new ISP or DSPs. So that is the first in the toolkits. That one is again geared specifically to the direct support professional as guidance for them to learn more about better documentation. All right, let me flip to the next one. Well, why does it not want to open? Screen sharing has closed. Well, I need you to open back up. Share. Okay, here we go. All right, this is our second document in the toolkit. This document is for supervisors. And within this toolkit, there are 4 support sheets. The first support sheet for the supervisor is a way for you to utilize this in your documentation reviews. So again, you have that list of the non-negotiable 14s that you can refer to as you go through your DSP's documentation. And then you can score those. And this is just an indicator of kind of what the outcome of that scoring is. If a DSP, if their documentation is scored 12 to 14, that means that they are either billing perfectly or with minor corrections needed, and gives you some ideas on how to address those. If they score a 9 to 11, it really indicates a need for coaching and helping them in rewriting and practicing to rewrite so that they can better score better in further reviews. And then anything that's 9 or below really is an indicator that that service should not be billed, that the documentation doesn't have the elements needed to support the billing. And you really need to immediately address those issues. There is a supervisor tip about reviewing at least 10% of each DSP's notes weekly. We understand as frontline supervisors the how full your plates are with the work that you do, but trying to identify at least some percentage of documentation and notes that you review weekly, again, really shows the importance of documentation to your DSPs. The second supervisor sheet is spotting red flags. And it just breaks things into, yellow flags. Okay, I need to do some training, some coaching, support my DSPs if I see some of these things. Orange flags really are those mid-level indicators of concern. And it gives you some ideas of if you see these indicators, here are some things that you can do utilizing the coaching tools and supporting your DSPs. And then those red flags, those immediate escalations. The third support sheet is the coaching sheet, and it just gives you the steps to help you do successful coaching with your DSPs and some ideas of in each step how you can work directly with your DSP to improve their documentation. And then the final support sheet is just a decision guide to help you make decisions about when to escalate documentation issues. So again, this toolkit, the supervisor DSP documentation sheets, are really for you, the frontline supervisor, the manager, the person who is going to be doing the review of those DSP documentation sheets. And then the third one I cannot get the third one to come up, so I apologize. The third one, which again will be part of your toolkit that we're going to send you, is just a coaching checklist. So when you are coaching your direct support professionals, it breaks it into the different parts of documentation, and it gives you 3 or 4 different things specific to ISP alignment, for instance, and having a conversation about how to incorporate descriptions of the service and how they align with the ISP. It gives you examples that you can share with your DSP. You can write notes on there about how the conversation with the DSP went, what questions might they have had, and then specifically at the bottom there's a follow-up action plan. And so that's so that you and the DSP, as you're working together on the coaching process, can both leave that coaching session with what are the next steps? What do we need to do next? Are we going to get back together in a couple of weeks? Is the supervisor going to pull my documentation more frequently and look at it? How are we going to follow up on those coaching needs? So all of those sheets will be part of the handouts that we're going to send to you. I know there are several comments in chat, so I'm going to jump over to that real quick and try to take a look at those. And again, Christy, thank you so much for helping monitor chat. Okay. Lisa, my email and Christy's email are going to be on the last slide. And so if you or your agency is interested in someone coming out and doing some support with you, whether it's around, documentation and improving your documentation system or any other, quality indicators or needs that you have, please feel free to reach out to Christy or I via email, and we can connect you with our compliance team, our support team, who can schedule time with you if that's something that you're interested in. So we're really excited that, these sessions are, creating some of that interest. And if we can support you with your agency in a more one-on-one, in-person way, we are absolutely happy to do that. That is absolutely the goal and one of the major missions of 19 services. Some folks joined late, have a few questions. Let me go back to the presentation here, and we'll go over the last slide in the presentation, which I think will answer some of those questions. Okay. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just reiterate that the copy of the presentation will be sent out to you in a few days. I would expect that you'll have it by probably on Monday. It will include the PowerPoint. It will include the toolkit and all those handouts that I talked about. It will include a link to the recording of this session, which is available or will be available by Monday on our YouTube channel. It will also include your certificate of attendance. So make sure you're watching for that follow-up email because that's where you're going to see all of this information. Our next session will be held June 18th at 10 a.m. for agency providers. I apologize, I did not look to see what our next topic will be, but we will share that out on the follow-up email. It will tell you what the next topic will be. It will also have the registration link in there, so you can go ahead and get registered for that. For anyone who is interested in these sessions, again, we do them once a month. The third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. When you register, you can register for the June session, or you can go in multiple times and go ahead and register for August, September, October. So the registration is set up so you can pick which month you want to register for, and you can go ahead and register for all of them if you want. That way you have them on your calendar. If you are not already, please join us on Facebook at 19 or sorry, Network 19. That is where you're going to see a lot of information about upcoming trainings. We do a newsletter once a week called Tuesday Newsday. So you'll see those on there. The toolkits that I created for this will also be shared. So if you're familiar with Facebook, within the Facebook page, you can go to a section called Guides, and guides are just folders full of information about a specific topic. So you will see that there's a guide in there with all the documentation templates that DODD has put out. You will see that there is a guide there on tax tips. So we did a training for independent providers on filing taxes. So there's a guide there. And then we'll have a new guide that has documentation toolkit. So you can get all of those resources. So please, if you use Facebook, go in, put in a request to join. We'll get you connected. It's also meant to be a space where you all can network with each other. So we encourage you to ask questions on there, to answer questions on there. We also will pop in and answer questions and share resources and information. And then also, if you have an upcoming event or something going on, whether it's in your region or whether it's a statewide event, feel free to post those on there as well. I do review them before they get posted just to make sure we keep some oversight of the page, but other than that, you are welcome to do that. I'm going to go through here really quick because we have a session that starts like right now with our independent providers. I don't think there's any questions. I think a lot of this is just thank yous and feedback on today's event. Thank you very much for joining us. Reach out if we can help you in any way, and have a wonderful day and a great Memorial holiday. Thank you.